Hello. First of all, I have to say that this video, I'm not going to try monetizing it on YouTube because they wouldn't let me anyway. So I need your help with passing it around if you think it's worthy of that. And secondly, this is the second of two videos I'm making about the great trans issue. And as I said in the first video, what triggered it off was a dust-up in the Scottish Nationalist Party, but what's happening is just as applicable to the executive orders issued by the new Biden government. So I do hope that you guys in the USA will keep on watching. It's not just confined to Scotland. In my last video, I'd connected the sacking of a Scottish Nationalist MP called Joanna Cherry to the issue of transgender politics, at least to the semblance of tolerance. You may first of all ask why Nicola Sturgeon is making a thing of it. Obviously, she's using this as an excuse to remove a political rival, but then we can ask, why does she think that using this particular excuse gives her argument either any credibility or even more any traction with the voters? After all, transgender people are hardly a huge part of the voting population. Figures are actually rather difficult to find out. The Office of National Statistics here in Britain were asked about it, and this was the question under the Freedom of Information Act: approximately how many transgender people are thought to live in the United Kingdom? And the answer was, the Office of National Statistics do not produce estimates of the number of transgender people living in the UK. The Office of National Statistics published a position paper in 2009, and this remains the current position of the ONS. So there. But the numbers do have to be vanishingly small. After all, the homosexual population as a whole is only 2% of the population. So when you're going for a voting constituency, it's a statistical irrelevancy. And it doesn't make sense that this is such a big political issue. But please bear with me, because political chicanery that I'm going to be talking about is coming to you wherever in the world you are. So let's start with the MP for Edinburgh. No, that's Edinburgh South West, Joanna Cherry. Joanna Cherry was a front bench politician for the SNP and by all accounts a popular and energetic representative. Now, I disagree very profoundly with the ambitions of the SNP. But that doesn't stop me from giving credit where credit is due. Apparently, Cherry was a good politician of principle, and she was sacked by Nicola Sturgeon, the current head of the SNP. She wasn't shunted aside, by the way. She wasn't reassigned to another, possibly less important post. She was sacked. Now, this is unusual because in British politics in general, an incompetent or an uncooperative minister is shuffled sideways somehow to another department with some cosmetic shuffling of the other ministers as well. But not in this case. In this case, the MP was simply sacked. I mean, she's still a member of Parliament, a member of the Scottish Parliament. She's just not in she's not a minister anymore, and she was simply sacked. And this was because Cherry supported a contender to the leadership and had herself become a serious threat to Sturgeon's grip on the party. But Sturgeon couldn't admit that. So the reason she gave was that Cherry had not been towing the line on the SNP stance on gender identity. Cherry was criticising, for instance, the fact that men who say they identify as women would be legally allowed to use women-only facilities like gym changing rooms, for instance. While this also means that biological men are allowed to compete against women in sports. Sturgeon didn't call Cherry out and out a transphobe, but she did imply it in a speech a couple of weeks ago in which she said, now what was it? No debate can be a cover for transphobia. Now, first of all, I want to make clear my attitude to this whole debate because, unfortunately, as has become increasingly common recently, words are being thrown about that don't mean exactly what they're supposed to mean. So to start with, I'm talking only about men dressing or living as women. I'm not talking about women dressing and living as men. And that's because I see this as an entirely different category, because when a woman dresses as a man, she, generally speaking, poses no danger to men in general. While it is demonstrably the case that when a man dresses as a woman, he has at the very least the potential to be seriously dangerous to women. And without going too much into the cases where, for instance, male sex offenders said they identify as women and have been placed in female prisons with predictable consequences, let's just stay with situations where men dress and pretend to be women and compete in women's sports and injure women by the use of their superior strength and weight, either deliberately or by accident. For instance, in wrestling, where it's probably deliberate, or just cannoning into them in hockey matches, that sort of thing. I dealt with that in my previous video, but now I'm going to talk about an even more dangerous subset, which is the trans man, and I'm not going to call them trans women because they're definitely not women, the sort who's certainly psychologically disturbed. Like this, for instance. I'm going to play a video. I don't know how long it's going to take, so I'll just freeze me and then get back to you when it's finished.
You're going to give me my fucking money back.
Excuse me, sir. There's a young man in here.
Excuse me, it's ma'am. It is ma'am.
I can call the police if you'd like me to. You need to settle down.
You need to settle down and mind your business, okay? Ma'am, once again, ma'am.
I said both of you.
No, you said sir. Once again, it's ma'am.
I actually said both of you guys. It was general.
Right beforehand, you fucking said sir.
Sir? Okay.
Motherfucker, take it outside. If you want to call me sir again, I will show you a fucking sir.
I apologize.
Motherfucker.
I apologize now.
I need your corporate number, because I'm going to call them and talk about how it's misgendered several times in this store.
I apologize for that.
I need your corporate number now.
I can get that for you. Like, it's not a problem.
Get it for me now.
I can do that. I'm going to ask you to calm down and stop cussing.
Give me your corporate number. Well, I'm going to ask you for the 5th time to stop calling me a man, because quite clearly I am not.
And I apologize. I'm sorry for that, ma'am. I will get you that number. Is that okay?
Yes, get it for me now.
I'm asking you to stop
Get it
cussing.
for me now. I'm not cussing. I'm not cussing.
Okay.
Give me the damn number now, please.
Ma'am, I apologize.
And I saw a news clip in which they played that video and the announcer said something like, well, is this a person behaving badly, or is it a trans woman insisting on her right to be treated humanely? It was something like that. I mean, what hope do we have for society when news announcers can't tell the difference between someone with some sort of psychosis indulging in some terrible bullying and a civilized person asking to be treated politely? But this is to the advantage of some people, you know. Now, I'm not talking about those men who like to dress as women as a sort of hobby. That's fine with me. And I'm not talking about those men who, while still physically male, feel better living as women and just trying to have as normal a life as possible and not making a fuss about it. And I'm definitely not talking about those men who are so convinced they're women that they resort to desperate measures, hormone treatment that will go on more or less for the rest of their lives, painful operations and continual medical intervention because, you know, to stop the body from healing itself back up, a trans A man who resembles a female physically has to have continual medical intervention to stop to stop the body from healing itself up again. Sorry, I'm trying to keep things family friendly. In general, these people just want to be accepted as women. They want to live as normal a life as possible and keep their lives to themselves. No, I'm talking about that chap in the video, or this person who calls himself Jessica and who's made a career out of bullying mostly young women and destroying their lives and their careers. In case you didn't know about him, this is a man who is still biologically and physically a man, but who dresses in skirts and has taken beauticians to court for transphobia when they refuse to wax his genital area. Very often, this is in Canada, very often these are Asian women who went into the beauty business because it keeps them away from men. And Jessica Yaniv has sued them successfully for their businesses and their livelihoods because the courts, interpreting the law the way it's been framed, have had no choice but to find the women guilty of transphobia or prejudice or whatever. Now, I did say in my previous video that it's my belief that what impels men into this weird way of behaving is actually a hatred of women, and I shall stick with that. At its least dangerous, it finds expression in the behaviour of someone like a British artist called Grayson Perry, who frequently dresses like this. Now, there's no doubt he uses that as a way of getting attention. He's pretty good at pottery, but there are many just as good, although not as famous, and that's the reason why. It's never been suggested that Perry is a danger to women, by the way. I want to make that absolutely clear. But I find his parodying of femininity extremely offensive, actually. And I think he probably knows that as well. But it's a sort of power, isn't it? It's a power over the women who are made uncomfortable. And it's also a power over men and women who have to strain to be polite with such a weird creature in front of them. And that's the point. He's making people dance to his tune. And that's what politicians are doing as well. And I'm going to talk here now about the British Labour Party. In the last elections, one of the campaigners was a British comedian and actor called Eddie Izzard. At the time this picture was taken, he was simply known as a cross-dresser. Recently, he's been saying he identifies as a woman, but I'll leave that on one side. Izzard was boosted as one of the faces of Labour. And when I saw him campaigning in northern constituencies, no less, I think Yorkshire was one of them. I couldn't understand how the Labour Party could imagine this would get them any votes. I didn't think that many Yorkshiremen would go for that sort of stuff. Frankly, I rather imagine it would have been something of a vote killer. And it was when I considered Sturgeon's behaviour and then thought back to the Labour campaign that I put 2 and 2 together. You may say I've made 5 out of it, but well, this is my theory. You see, the Labour Party and the Scottish Nationalists are both parties that were and are basing their political platform on a set of lies. But they're lies that have a slight possibility of being taken for truth, at least by the ideologically blinded. In the case of the Labour Party, they said they were supporting their traditional base, the white working classes, when they were calling the white working classes racist oafs for objecting to Pakistani gangs raping their daughters. The Labour Party said it was one of inclusivity when they were forcing out Jewish members and organising anti-Semitic online and physical hate groups. The Labour Party said it was merely socialist when it had been taken over by a cabal of Marxists. As for the Scottish National Party, they say that Scotland can manage on its own. away from England when it manifestly cannot. It has a very small population, and much of it ends up in England anyway for, well, lack of opportunities there. The government they have now, headed by the SNP, can't even organise their vaccination campaign. They made a complete horlicks of that. Education in Scotland, once the pride of that country, has descended into chaos and inefficiency. Scotland does have oil, but it's no Norway. It has none of the resources with which Norway is also blessed. Metals and timber, for instance, and about 2/3 of Scotland are uninhabitable by any but the hardiest and the most determined. The Highlands, as beautiful as they are, and they should be seen, but they grow nothing but heather and bracken, and in the winter they're practically unlivable. No, Scotland cannot manage on its own. It's even been rejected as a separate unit by the EU, who don't want another burden on their finances, and they would dearly love to give England a black eye. They're doing their best to do that with Ireland, but they're just not touching Scotland with a barge pole. So here we have two political parties based on lies. And my theory is this: the two parties base themselves on lies, but lies that almost could be truth. Almost. But not to anyone with any critical of facility. And then there's the Biden administration, also founded on lies. Well, you name them, one after the other. And they too have gone in a big way for gender identification issues. And this is, it all seems to be part of a piece somewhere. Deep down, they know they're lying well, and they also know that people know they're lying, even their supporters. So what they have to do is come up with a lie so extreme that it would be impossible to believe. If they can come up with something so demonstrably false and totally impossible, like men are women, for instance, then by pulling them into this extreme of mental pretzelization, then they'll be able to warp people's minds to the extent that it would be a relief to accept the less convoluted lies that lay in the middle between the truth and something like this thing about transphobia. Well, that's my theory anyway. So don't forget, this video, I'm not going to try to monetize it because YouTube won't accept any monetization on this, because that's all part of the parcel. YouTube itself is more and more basing itself on lies, isn't it? The lie that it's a free speech platform. So please help me by sharing and liking and subscribing, but most of all, by sharing. Why not treat yourself or a favoured relative or friend to these magnificent examples of merch? The mugs and t-shirts come in the Graniopteryx design or Grambo with a firearm or the more deadly knitting needles. Go to www.graniopteryx.com and whatever platform you're watching this on, please click like, subscribe and share.